He bought an abandoned mansion in rural Vermont for almost nothing, a crumbling estate everyone in town whispered was cursed. Thomas Reed, a widowed architect searching for peace, only wanted a quiet place to rebuild his life with his loyal German shepherd, Luna. But buried beneath the rose garden of the Rose Lake estate was a century-old secret: journals, bones, and a love story so tragic it had been sealed away for generations. What began as a man's escape from grief became a journey through time, redemption, and divine grace. One that would heal hearts, unearth truth, and prove that even the darkest past can bloom again under the light of faith. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? The morning sky over Vermont hung low and gray, the air crisp and sharp enough to taste. Mist clung to the ground like memory, curling between birch trunks and overgrown hedges. When Thomas Reed stepped out of his car, the gravel crunched beneath his boots, a lonely sound swallowed by the valley's quiet. He stood there for a moment, breathing in the cold, feeling the weight of it settle inside him. He had come a long way from New York, 4 hours north and a lifetime apart. The road that had once been filled with meetings, calls, and expensive obligations now led him here, to an estate abandoned for nearly half a century. Thomas was 52, tall, with the athletic build of someone who still jogged out of habit more than joy. His hair was a storm of silver and brown, neatly trimmed, and his beard, salted at the chin, gave him the look of a man constantly negotiating with time. Behind his steel-gray eyes hid exhaustion, the kind that didn't come from work, but from losing someone he couldn't replace. His late wife, Margaret, had loved roses, the kind that bloomed too early and died too quickly. The real estate agent had called it the Rose Lake Estate, a grand name for a place that looked like it had forgotten how to be proud. The 3-story house loomed at the end of a narrow path lined with dead rose bushes. Windows clouded by dust gave no reflection. The porch sagged slightly, and ivy clutched the walls like desperate hands. Beside Thomas, Luna trotted forward. She was a German shepherd, 6 years old, with fur that shimmered between gold and charcoal in the weak daylight. Her ears stood alert, her amber eyes intelligent and watchful. Luna had once been a search and rescue dog, trained to find what others lost. After Margaret's death, Thomas had adopted her from a police officer friend, telling himself he was saving her. The truth was simpler. He needed someone to come home to. "Looks like it's just you and me, girl," he murmured, brushing his hand along her neck. Her tail wagged once, solemnly, as if she understood the gravity of starting over. Inside, the air smelled of dust, old wood, and something faintly floral, ghostly traces of perfume long gone. Dust motes spun through the light, leaking from the cracked shutters. Thomas ran his hand along a banister that creaked in protest. The floors were uneven, the walls lined with faded wallpaper, depicting roses that had lost their color. He could hear Luna's nails clicking as she explored, moving room to room, tail raised but cautious. For all its decay, there was something captivating about the house. It carried dignity, even in ruin, and Thomas, who had spent decades surrounded by sterile perfection, found its imperfections comforting. This house, like him, had survived something. He spent the morning walking through the estate, counting rooms, noting repairs, imagining what Margaret might have said about the view from the library. Her voice still lived somewhere in him, soft and teasing. "You'll never rest unless you find something broken to fix." By noon, he stood behind the house, where the land sloped gently toward a half-frozen pond. The garden stretched wide and wild, once manicured, now claimed by weeds and thorns. Yet in the middle of it all, the roses still grew, wild, tangled, beautiful in their defiance. Luna darted through the overgrowth, nose twitching, tail stiff. Then she stopped abruptly and began to bark, low, deep, uneasy. "What is it, girl?" Thomas followed her through the vines. Beneath a canopy of overgrown rose branches, he saw it, a door. It wasn't part of any visible structure, just a rectangular iron hatch half buried in the ground, its hinges hidden beneath roots. The metal was thick, cold, and streaked with rust, but the handle, an ornate twist of iron, looked newer, almost polished. Thomas knelt, brushing away the soil. The door was locked, but what caught his attention wasn't the lock. It was that the bolts were on the inside. He frowned. "That's odd." Luna sniffed at the edges, ears flattening. Then she growled, a sound Thomas had never heard from her before. That was when he felt it too. the strange pressure in the air, the faint hum beneath the earth, as if something deep below had stirred at their presence. He stood abruptly, heart beating faster than reason could justify. A voice startled him. "You shouldn't be here after sundown." Thomas turned. A woman stood near the garden fence, her hands tucked into a knitted shawl. She looked to be around 49, her figure slender but strong in the way of someone used to work, not idleness. Her hair, chestnut streaked with silver, was pinned loosely at her nape, and her face, lined gently at the corners, had the kind of beauty that felt lived in, not manufactured. "I'm sorry," Thomas said, brushing dirt from his hands. "Didn't mean to trespass. I just bought the place." "I know," she replied, her voice calm but guarded. "Word travels fast in small towns. I'm Eleanor Gray." The surname tugged at his memory. He'd read it in the property papers. "Gray, as in the original owners?" She nodded once. "My family built this estate long before I was born. I live just across the field." Eleanor's eyes drifted toward the half-buried door. A flicker of something, recognition, maybe even fear, passed over her features. "You found it." Thomas glanced back at the hatch. "Found what?" Her expression tightened. "The old cellar entrance. My grandfather used to say it led nowhere worth going." "Nowhere worth going?" Thomas echoed, half amused. "That's an interesting way of putting it." Eleanor looked at him then, really looked, as if weighing the kind of man he was. "Mr. Reed," she said quietly, "some doors were meant to stay closed, especially on this land." He tried to laugh it off, but the sound died in his throat. "You believe in ghosts, Ms. Gray?" "I believe in history," she said simply, "and history doesn't forget." Luna barked again, sharp and uneasy, circling the hatch. Eleanor flinched at the sound. "Keep that dog away from the garden after dark," she warned softly. "Animals sense what people choose to ignore." Before Thomas could ask what she meant, Eleanor turned and walked back toward the fog, her figure slowly dissolving into the gray air. The valley fell silent again. Only the rustle of roses and the whisper of wind remained. Thomas stood there for a long time, staring at the door beneath the thorns. Then, faintly, so faintly he almost doubted his own senses, he thought he heard something from beneath it. A sound like breathing. Rain had been falling since morning, thin and cold, veiling the valley in gray ribbons that blurred the outlines of trees and rooftops. The Rose Lake estate seemed half drowned in mist. Its windows wept condensation, and the garden, already wild, turned to a sea of trembling roses glistening with raindrops like tears. Inside the study, Thomas Reed sat at a small oak desk, the one he'd cleaned only yesterday, watching Luna pace near the back door. She was restless, her paws damp from darting out into the rain despite his protests. The German Shepherd had grown more protective lately, sleeping near the garden door, ears twitching to every sound. Thomas felt it too, the strange tension that had crept into the house since that night. The faint breathing he thought he had heard from the buried door replayed in his mind. Logic told him it was the wind, or maybe water draining through the old cellar, but something deeper, irrational and cold, whispered otherwise. He shook the thought away, pushing himself to focus on mundane tasks, a list of repairs, bills for roof work, and an unopened envelope from the local property office. But Luna barked sharply again, dragging him back to the present. "All right, girl," he sighed, pulling on his raincoat. "Let's see what's gotten into you." Outside, the rain drummed on his shoulders and the air smelled of wet iron and soil. Luna darted ahead toward the overgrown rose arch. Her tail was stiff, her nose low to the ground. She began digging furiously near the same patch of tangled roots that hid the iron door. Mud flew in all directions until her paw struck something that rang hollow. Thomas knelt beside her, brushing aside the soil to reveal a small metal piece tarnished and cold to the touch. The latch had rusted, but after some effort, he pried it open. Inside lay a folded envelope, edges browned by time, sealed with wax stamped with an ornate G. Written in elegant script across the front. "To whoever inherits Rose Lake." He carried the box inside, Luna close behind, and set it gently on the desk. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the strange intimacy of holding a message meant for someone like him nearly a century ago. The letter inside was dated June 14th, 1932. "To the next soul who dares call this house their own," it began, "there is truth buried beneath your feet. Truth that can save one spirit but ruin an entire bloodline. Edward Gray built this estate not to honor love, but to bury it. Seek the chamber beneath the roses, and you will find both redemption and curse." Thomas read it twice, heart pounding. He had expected an old deed, a recipe, some trivial relic of the past, but not this. He could almost hear the voice of the writer, trembling between warning and confession. The mention of Edward Grey struck a chord. He remembered Eleanor's name, her warning, her hesitation. He needed to talk to her. That evening, after the rain eased into a silver drizzle, he vowed, crossed the field to Eleanor's home, a small white cottage framed by hydrangeas. The faint light through the windows made the place look like a painting, warm, alive, and safe. Eleanor opened the door before he could knock twice. She wore a faded green sweater, her hair loose for once, falling in soft curls that framed her face. Without the guarded look she had at the garden, she seemed younger, almost gentle. "Mr. Reed," she said, her voice softer than before. "Out on a night like this?" "I found something," he replied, holding out the box. It was buried near that iron door. Her expression changed instantly. She stepped aside, motioning him in. The room smelled faintly of rosemary and tea, the scent grounding after the estate's musty air. Books lined the shelves, most about botany and local history. Eleanor examined the letter carefully under the lamplight. Her fingers trembled ever so slightly. "This seal, it belonged to my great-grandfather, Edward Grey." "So he really lived here," Thomas said quietly. "Yes. Edward was the first Grey to build Rose Lake. He was complicated." She hesitated, searching for the right word. "A man of reason and control, yet haunted by what he couldn't control, love, loss, and pride." "Who wrote the letter?" "I don't know," she admitted, "but I can tell you this. Edward's wife, Eliza, disappeared in 1932. They said she drowned in the pond behind the garden, but her body was never found." Thomas felt a shiver run down his spine. "The same year the letter was written." Eleanor nodded. "The townsfolk say Edward locked himself in the house for months afterward. When he emerged, he'd grown a beard, stopped attending church, and forbade anyone from entering the garden again." Thomas leaned back, trying to process the overlapping timelines. "If she didn't drown, maybe she's what's down there." "Don't say that," Eleanor whispered, almost pleading. "Some things are better left unknown." But curiosity was stronger than caution. He spent the next day in the town's small library, a building that smelled of paper and pine polish. The librarian, Mr. Harold Benton, an elderly man with a face creased like worn leather, greeted him with polite suspicion. Harold had lived in the town all his life. His voice carried that quiet authority small-town elders wield effortlessly. "The Grey family, eh?" he muttered, adjusting his bifocals. "Folks still whisper about that name. Wealth and tragedy go hand in hand up there." Thomas explained what he had found. Harold led him to a dusty corner where local archives were kept. Old newspapers, census sheets, property deeds. Together they found a small article from August 1932. "Eliza Grey missing. Family declines search." No details, no follow-up. The case had simply ended. Later, Eleanor joined him there, her hands covered in the faint scent of roses. She had come straight from her garden. Watching her pore over the faded papers beside him, Thomas felt something stir that he hadn't felt in years. Quiet companionship, the kind that made silence between two people feel full instead of empty. "Maybe she tried to escape," Eleanor murmured, eyes tracing the brittle newsprint. "Edward was controlling. He managed every penny, every visitor, every word spoken in that house." Thomas studied her face, graceful but shadowed. "You sound like you knew him." "In a way, I did," she said softly. "My grandmother raised me on stories of this place. Some nights she'd wake screaming, saying she saw a woman's face in the roses. I thought it was just grief, but now—" She didn't finish the sentence. That evening, when they returned to Rose Lake, the rain had stopped completely. The air was cool and still, scented faintly with earth and rose petals. Luna trotted beside them, her fur glistening from the dew, tail swaying in rhythm to their footsteps. Eleanor lingered near the archway. "You know," she said, "roses are stubborn things. You can burn them, cut them, bury them, and they'll still find a way back to the light." Thomas smiled faintly. "You sound like someone who's been burned a few times." She gave a quiet laugh. "Maybe I have, but you can't grow new ones unless you plant again." Together they cleared a small patch of soil, planting new rose cuttings Eleanor had brought. It felt almost ceremonial, a promise whispered between past and present. When they finished, the moon had risen pale over the mist. Thomas looked at the dark patch of ground where the iron door lay hidden beneath roots. For a moment, he thought he saw movement, the faint tremor of the vines, though no wind stirred. "Did you see that?" he asked. Eleanor turned, puzzled. "See what?" But when he looked again, the vines were still, and the garden was silent except for Luna's low, uncertain growl. The cold came early that winter, sweeping across Vermont like an old, uninvited ghost. The Rose Lake estate lay cloaked in snow, its chimneys trailing thin threads of smoke against the pewter sky. Inside, the radiators hummed softly, but the air still felt colder than it should have, as though the house itself exhaled frost. Thomas Reed had learned to live with the estate's moods, the groaning pipes, the sighs in the wood, the occasional tap-tap that came from no clear source. Yet tonight felt different. He woke to Luna's growl, low, guttural, and urgent. The digital clock read 2:43 a.m. The sound of wind brushed against the windows, but Luna wasn't reacting to the weather. Her ears were erect, her fur bristling along the ridge of her back. Thomas sat up slowly, the old floorboards creaking beneath his feet. "What is it, girl?" he whispered, reaching for the flashlight on the nightstand. Luna answered with another growl, then moved toward the back door. Her nails clicked against the hardwood floor with anxious rhythm. Thomas followed her through the dark hallway, past portraits whose painted eyes seemed to shimmer in the beam of his light. When they reached the kitchen, the sound came, faint, rhythmic, metal shuddering softly beneath layers of soil and vines. He stepped out into the freezing night, flashlight slicing through the mist. Snow had fallen thinly across the rose garden, coating the tangled branches like bone dust. Luna barked once, sharp and commanding, then froze. The beam of light caught the iron door, trembling, just slightly, but undeniably moving, as though something pressed from below. Thomas's breath misted in the air. He forced a shaky laugh, trying to rationalize it. Settling soil, expanding metal in the cold, he told himself. But then came another sound, a dull, dragging scrape, like fingernails against iron. Luna barked again, pacing in circles. "Hey!" Thomas shouted toward the garden, his voice too loud for the hour. "Who's there?" Only silence answered. The trembling stopped. The world seemed to hold its breath. The next morning, gray daylight revealed something worse. Footprints. Not the small, even prints of animals, but human ones, deep and unmistakable. They led from the rose arch to the narrow path that disappeared into the woods behind the estate. Thomas crouched, tracing one print with his finger. The edges were sharp. Whoever had been there came after the snowfall, no more than a few hours ago. Luna sniffed the prints, tail low, growling softly. Her body was tense but determined. Thomas called the sheriff's office that afternoon. The responding officer, Deputy Carl Jenkins, arrived just after lunch. He was in his late 30s, a broad-shouldered man with the kind of polite weariness common in small-town lawmen. His brown uniform was neatly pressed, but his heavy boots and salt-stained parka told of long days on muddy roads. His face was square, framed by a short, practical beard. A small scar ran down his cheek, the mark of a childhood accident, he explained easily when Thomas glanced at it. "So," Carl said, walking slowly around the garden, "you're telling me you saw the door move on its own?" "I didn't imagine it," Thomas said evenly. "And those prints weren't here last night." Carl crouched to examine them. "Could be kids. We've had trouble before, locals sneaking up here for dares. You've got the oldest haunted house in 3 counties, Mr. Reed. It's practically a magnet." Thomas frowned. "You think kids could lift that door? It's solid iron." Carl gave a non-committal shrug. "Maybe they didn't. Maybe they just poked around. Snow makes sounds you don't expect. Expansion, wind tunnels, small animals under the roots. Nature can be stranger than fiction." Luna growled quietly behind him, unimpressed by the explanation. "Still," Carl added, "I'll patrol near here for a few nights, just in case." He handed Thomas a small card. "Call if you see or hear anything unusual, but my money's on pranksters." After the deputy left, Thomas stood in the garden long after dusk, unable to shake the image of that trembling door. He couldn't explain it, but it had felt alive, like something had noticed him. That night, he sat near the fireplace, reading. Luna lay curled at his feet, twitching in her sleep. The wind rattled the shutters, and the smell of burning oak filled the room. He tried to lose himself in the words on the page, but they slipped past him unread. His eyes kept drifting to the window that faced the garden. He didn't notice when Eleanor arrived until Luna lifted her head and wagged her tail. Eleanor's knock was soft, hesitant. She stood in the doorway with a wool shawl drawn tight around her shoulders, her cheeks pink from the cold. "I heard what happened," she said, stepping inside. "Carl told me." "You think it was kids?" Thomas asked. "I think this place has a way of drawing the living toward the dead," she replied. Her eyes flicked to the frost-streaked glass. "Did you see the footprints yourself?" He nodded. "Too big for a child." Eleanor's hand trembled slightly as she brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "Thomas, I didn't tell you everything. There was another Eleanor Gray once, the first of my name. My grandmother said she vanished from this very estate. The family always claimed she ran off with a traveler, but the truth—" She hesitated, voice dropping. "No one ever found her." Thomas felt a chill crawl down his spine. "You think the letter, the door, they're connected to her?" Eleanor met his gaze, her expression fragile but unflinching. "I think her story never ended. And maybe we're standing in the middle of its unfinished chapter." Luna suddenly lifted her head, ears forward, tail rigid. Then she barked, once, twice, and dashed toward the back door. Thomas and Eleanor followed her outside. Snow glowed faintly beneath the moonlight. The garden was still except for Luna, who began digging furiously near the rose arch once more. Thomas grabbed a lantern and crouched beside her. The soil was soft beneath the snow. Within moments, something metallic glinted under the beam. It wasn't the box from before. It was small, round. Thomas brushed the dirt away and lifted it. A ring. Gold, dulled with age, engraved inside with the initials E.G. Eleanor's breath caught. She stepped back as though the sight burned her. That can't be." Thomas turned the ring in his hand. "Your initials." "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "Not mine. Hers. Eleanor Gray, the first." She looked at the ring as though it had just resurrected a ghost. Luna whined softly, pressing close to Thomas's leg. "This was under the roots," Thomas murmured. "Buried just inches from that door." Eleanor's voice trembled. "My grandmother said she wore a ring just like this on the night she disappeared, the night before the pond froze over." Thomas stood, his mind racing. The air around them felt heavy, charged, as though the earth itself was listening. "If the ring's here," he said, "then maybe she never left." The wind rose suddenly, carrying the faint scent of roses, though none bloomed in the snow. Somewhere below their feet came a single, soft clang, metal striking metal, as if something deep beneath the garden had just shifted. Eleanor turned toward the sound, her face pale as frost. "Thomas," she whispered, "what if the one who's trying to come out isn't her?" The following day rose pale and brittle, a weak winter sun straining through the fog, like an old lamp behind frosted glass. Thomas Reed had slept little, haunted by the echo of that metallic clang. He sat at the breakfast table with untouched coffee, eyes on the frost-veined window that overlooked the garden. The gold ring engraved E.G. lay on the tablecloth beside his hand, its cold gleam a quiet accusation. Luna sat at his feet, head resting on her paws, her amber eyes following his every movement. She seemed tense, aware that something was shifting in her master's mind. Eleanor arrived just after noon, wrapped in a charcoal wool coat, her face pale beneath the shadow of her hat. She looked older that day, as though sleeplessness had drawn fine lines at the corners of her eyes. Yet her presence filled the room with a calm gravity. "You're thinking about opening it," she said simply. Thomas didn't deny it. "The door has been calling since the night we found the ring. Whatever is beneath that ground has been waiting for nearly a century. It's not right to leave it buried." Eleanor's gaze was steady, though her hands trembled slightly as she removed her gloves. "Edward Gray sealed that place for a reason. My grandmother used to whisper that he swore an oath before God, that no Gray would ever break the seal." Thomas turned the ring in his fingers. "Then maybe it takes someone who isn't a Gray." She hesitated, then sighed softly. "If you're going down there, you won't go alone." By dusk, the sky had turned violet and thin snowflakes drifted through the branches. Thomas gathered tools, an iron crowbar, a lantern, a small hand shovel, and a coil of rope. Luna paced anxiously as he worked, occasionally whining when his gloved hands brushed the lockbox. At the garden, the roses stood black against the snow, their branches brittle like the bones of forgotten things. The iron door loomed beneath them, dusted with frost. Thomas's breath steamed in the cold as he wedged the crowbar beneath the edge. The hinges groaned in protest, a metallic cry that carried through the still air. Eleanor flinched at the sound, gripping the lantern tighter. Together, they lifted. The seal cracked. A hiss of stale air escaped, cold, heavy, and faintly perfumed with decay. Beneath lay a narrow staircase spiraling into darkness. Thomas glanced at Eleanor. "Stay behind me." She nodded, but there was defiance in her eyes. Luna descended first, careful but unafraid. Her claws clicked softly on the stone steps, her nose twitching as she sniffed the stale air. Thomas followed with the lantern raised high, its dim light flickering against damp stone walls lined with faded roses painted by hand, petals smeared by time. The air was colder below, thick with moisture and the faint tang of iron. At the bottom, the stairs opened into a small underground room. Dust blanketed everything, and cobwebs hung like funeral veils. Along one wall stood a long wooden table, and upon it, a collection of objects untouched for decades. Journals bound in leather, a phonograph with several wax cylinders, and a small glass case containing wilted rose petals pressed flat between pages. Eleanor approached the table, her breath shallow. "These belong to Edward," she whispered. Thomas opened the top journal carefully. The first page bore Edward Gray's name, written in precise, slanted handwriting. Beneath it, the date, October 1932. He began to read aloud. "The truth is a burden no man can bear without losing himself. Eliza is gone, not by God's will, but by a hand I trusted more than my own. My brother, Henry, coveted both her and the inheritance. When she refused him, he struck her by the pond. I found her lifeless among the roses she loved." Eleanor pressed her hand to her mouth, eyes glistening. "Henry Gray, my great-grandfather." Thomas continued, his voice tight. "I could not expose him. The Gray name has built this town. To confess his crime would destroy everything. Every school, every church, every family tied to us. I buried Eliza beneath the roses and sealed the chamber with my own hands. I swore to God to let the truth die with me." Luna whined softly, circling near the far wall. Her ears pricked up, nose brushing against a seam in the stone. She began to scratch, claws scraping the mortar. "Wait," Thomas said, lowering the lantern. The light caught a faint outline in the wall, a hidden panel, nearly invisible under the grime. He pressed his hand to it, and the stone gave way with a hollow sound. Behind it lay a small alcove, and within, a shape wrapped in a tattered shroud. Eleanor gasped. The shroud had once been white, now gray with age. A single object lay upon the folded cloth, a dried rose impossibly preserved, its petals curled but intact. Thomas knelt, his throat tightening. "It's her," he said softly. "Eliza Gray." Eleanor sank to her knees beside him, tears streaming freely now. "After all these years, she's been here, waiting." On impulse, Thomas reached for one of the phonograph cylinders and placed it into the ancient player. The machine wheezed to life, scratching and crackling before a man's voice emerged, weary, trembling, haunted. "To whoever finds this," the recording said, "know that I am no murderer, but a coward. I built this tomb to protect my family's name, yet it has become my own prison. Eliza's spirit walks these halls, whispering forgiveness I cannot accept. When my time ends, may someone braver than I free her." The voice broke on the last word, then silence, deep, suffocating silence. Eleanor covered her face with her hands, sobbing quietly. "He wasn't evil," she murmured, "just broken by love and guilt." Thomas stood, his heart heavy yet strangely lighter, as if the truth had shifted something within the air. The lantern's light danced across the old walls, and for an instant he thought he saw movement, a shadow, slender and graceful, drifting near the alcove. A faint scent of roses filled the air, sweeter now, alive. Luna barked softly, not in warning this time, but almost in greeting. The dog's ears flattened, her tail wagging once before she sat still, watching the empty air as if following someone invisible leaving the room. Eleanor wiped her tears, voice barely a whisper. "She's free, isn't she?" Thomas nodded. "And so is he." As they ascended the staircase, the air felt warmer, the weight of the house somehow eased. Behind them, the iron door closed gently, not with force, but as though guided by unseen hands. When they stepped into the open night, snow had begun to fall again, quiet and clean. Eleanor took Thomas's hand, her grip firm despite her trembling. "The past finally rests," she said. But as Luna turned one last time toward the garden, her ears pricked again. Far below, from within the sealed earth, came a soft sound, a single note of music from the phonograph, playing itself though no one had touched it. Spring came late that year, but when it arrived, it came gently, like forgiveness. The snow melted in thin rivulets down the stone paths of Rose Lake, carrying away the last traces of winter's silence. The roses, once blackened by frost, began to stir again. New buds appeared among the thorns, crimson and gold, as if the earth itself had decided that the past had slept long enough. Thomas Reed stood at the edge of the garden, his hands tucked into the pockets of a light gray jacket. The sharpness had softened in his face. The lines around his mouth were still there, but now they bent upward more often. His silver hair caught the morning light, and his eyes, once clouded by loss, held a steadier calm. It had been 3 months since that night, the night they found Eliza Gray, the night when truth rose from the soil like dawn from shadow. The investigation that followed had drawn people from across the state. The local sheriff, Carl Jenkins, had returned with a full team and equipment, men in heavy coats, faces marked by curiosity and awe. He had treated Thomas and Eleanor with a new kind of respect since then, though his skepticism had never fully faded. When the forensic specialists confirmed that the remains indeed belonged to Eliza Gray, the discovery rippled through Vermont like a stone through still water. Newspapers printed the story under headlines of Gothic grandeur, love, murder, and redemption beneath the roses. For weeks the townspeople visited, whispering their own theories while the authorities worked quietly to exhume and rebury the remains in a proper cemetery. The truth had not destroyed the Gray name as Edward once feared. It had redeemed it. The town council, led by Mayor Jonathan Bell, a tall man with thinning blonde hair and the kind of politician's smile that could charm both farmers and financiers, announced that Rose Lake Estate would be preserved as a heritage site. Now, scaffolding surrounded part of the mansion as restoration crews worked on the walls and windows. Among them was Jacob Moore, a young restoration architect in his early 30s. He was lean and energetic, his brown curls perpetually dusted with sawdust, his hands always moving as if sculpting invisible structures in the air. He had a deep respect for old places, the kind of reverence that came from growing up watching his father rebuild barns and homes after hurricanes. Jacob often worked late, humming tunelessly, his enthusiasm contagious. "It's rare," Jacob said one morning, setting down his blueprint, "that a building gets a second life this way. Usually we restore stone and wood, not legacies." Thomas smiled faintly. Sometimes the two are the same. The estate was reborn as the Rose Museum of Truth, dedicated to the intertwined stories of Edward and Eliza Gray, a tale of love, guilt, and redemption. In the main hall, under glass, lay the preserved journals, the phonograph, and the single dried rose that had survived the century. Visitors came from nearby towns to read the entries in Edward's slanted handwriting, to listen to his trembling confession through restored speakers. Eleanor Gray, now officially listed as the museum's historical curator, spent her days overseeing exhibits and tending the garden. She wore her hair loose more often, its silver threads glinting softly in the light. Her presence carried an effortless grace. Even when surrounded by volunteers and tourists, she moved with a calm authority. Thomas often joined her outside in the evenings, where they worked side by side among the roses. Sometimes they spoke of the past. More often, they worked in silence, the kind that only exists between people who have shared something sacred. Luna remained their steadfast guardian. Her fur had grown thicker with age, silver threading through the dark saddle along her back. At 8 years old, she still carried herself with quiet strength, ears alert, tail slow and deliberate. She had a habit of lying near the old iron door, which was now permanently open and fitted with a glass covering to allow light into the chamber below. Visitors often remarked how she seemed to be watching something invisible. Children loved her. She had become something of a local legend herself, the dog who had unearthed history. Tourists took pictures, and Luna bore the attention with dignified patience, eyes always drifting back toward the roses. One late afternoon, as golden light fell across the garden, Eleanor came out with a small box in her hands. "You've been busy again," she said, smiling gently. Thomas wiped the dirt from his gloves. "I've been setting up something new, the Luna Foundation." She tilted her head. "The what?" "A rescue fund," he said, "for dogs that served in law enforcement or rescue units. They deserve peace when their work is done." He paused, glancing at Luna, who looked up at him with steady, wise eyes. "She saved me more than once. It feels right to give something back." Eleanor smiled, eyes softening. Margaret would have loved that. He looked at her, surprised. She had spoken his late wife's name only once before. You think so? I know so, she said, placing a hand over his. Her touch was warm, grounded. You're learning to love again, Thomas. That's what she'd want. He didn't answer, only covered her hand with his and looked out toward the setting sun. The light caught the roses, turning them almost translucent, petals glowing like stained glass. As twilight deepened, the workers left, and the garden fell into hush. Only the faint hum of evening insects and the creak of settling wood remained. Luna rose, padded to the edge of the open door, and sat facing the faint light that glimmered from below. Thomas and Eleanor stood beside her. Beneath the glass, the restored chamber glowed with soft illumination. The journals and phonograph rested peacefully under their cases, and the inscription, carved above the entrance, read, "Truth shall bloom where love once bled." Eleanor whispered, "She's at peace now." Thomas nodded slowly. "And maybe Edward too." They lingered until the stars appeared, their reflections shimmering faintly on the glass above the chamber. Luna lay down at their feet, her head resting on her paws. Her breathing was slow, content. For a long time, no one spoke. The night smelled of roses and renewal. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang from the church tower, its sound deep and kind. When Thomas finally spoke, his voice was low but sure. "You know," he said, "I used to believe some doors were better left closed. But now, I think, some doors were never meant to stay locked at all." Eleanor turned to him, her eyes shining in the moonlight. "Then let's keep this one open." They stood together, silent but complete, as the soft light from below flickered gently, no longer cold, but warm, golden, alive. And in that quiet moment, the past and present seemed to weave together like the vines around them, tangled, imperfect, but blooming still. Sometimes miracles don't come with thunder or blinding light. Sometimes they bloom quietly, like a rose reborn from frozen soil, or forgiveness whispered through the walls of an old house. Thomas found his light not through wealth or reason, but through faith, the kind that believes even buried love can rise again. And maybe that's how God works, not by changing the past, but by giving us the courage to open the doors we fear most. So, tonight, if your heart carries old wounds or secrets, let this story remind you, nothing is too lost for grace. Because where love and loyalty endure, the Lord still plants his miracles. May God bless you and everyone you hold dear. If this story touched your heart, please share it. Leave a comment about your own small miracles. And subscribe to join us for more stories of hope, faith, and redemption. Let's keep the light alive, together.